For more than half a century, the public has been subjected to an unending parade of catastrophic climate predictions, claims that the seas would submerge coastal cities by the year 2000, that the world would run out of food by the 1980s, or that entire nations would disappear beneath rising oceans by 2010. Each new decade brought forth a new generation of forecasters, certain that their models captured the precise trajectory of the planet's fate. And yet, as time marched on, the gap between prediction and reality widened. What has finally changed is not the rhetoric of alarm, but the public's response to it. After decades of dire warnings that failed to materialize as advertised, despite trillions in expenditures, the public has begun to treat new forecasts with the same skepticism one brings to a fortune teller who has missed the last dozen predictions. The pattern is not new. In the 1970s, the prevailing fear was global cooling. Headlines warned that a new ice age was imminent. Scientists quoted in major publications claimed that agricultural collapse and mass starvation were on the horizon unless decisive government action was taken. When the cooling failed to materialize, the narrative pivoted, quietly, to global warming. The solution, however, remained identical: greater political control, more regulations, and more taxpayer dollars. The predictions became more dramatic as the political rewards increased. In the late 1980s, politicians warned that rising sea levels would flood entire nations by the early 2000s. In 1989, a senior United Nations official declared that whole countries would be wiped off the map by 2000 if emissions were not drastically reduced. Instead, the affected nations saw population growth, urban expansion, and rising property values, hardly the telltale signs of disappearing land. By the early 2000s, some of the most visible climate advocates predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free by 2013. When that did not occur, the prediction was extended to 2016, then to 2020, and then silently retired. The rhetorical strategy was simple: make bold predictions with the urgency of apocalypse, enjoy the immediate political and financial rewards of crisis-driven public spending, and then quietly move on when the prophecy expired. The consequences of these failed predictions have been immensely costly. Governments worldwide have spent trillions, yes, trillions, on climate initiatives whose results often bear little resemblance to their promises. Massive subsidies for solar and wind projects were justified by claims that these technologies would soon replace fossil fuels entirely. Instead, nations that aggressively pursued this path often found themselves with higher energy prices, unreliable power grids, and increased dependence on natural gas and coal during periods when intermittent energy sources failed to deliver. Germany's Energiewende is a prime example. Lauded as a bold transition to renewable energy, it became one of the most expensive policy undertakings in Europe. After spending hundreds of billions of euros, Germany still relies heavily on coal during peak demand, has some of the continent's highest electricity prices, and in the wake of shutting down its nuclear plants, has increased its reliance on foreign energy sources. Political incentives all but guarantee such outcomes. A predicted crisis, real or exaggerated, expands political power, opens the floodgates of public spending, and creates entire industries dependent on the continuation of the emergency. Few bureaucracies have ever voluntarily declared their work finished. Climate bureaucracies are no exception. Their authority continues only so long as the threat remains urgent, existential, and perpetually just over the horizon. The public, however, has slowly begun to learn. One does not need a PhD in climatology to notice that beachfront property, especially among the wealthy, has increased in price decade after decade. Those who warn of rising seas are often the same individuals purchasing oceanfront mansions. When people observe such contradictions, they begin to suspect that the rhetoric of crisis may be less about empirical certainty and more about political convenience. Public skepticism has not arisen because people suddenly reject environmental stewardship. Rather, it stems from a recognition that alarmist predictions have been wielded as tools for expanding political control while failing to deliver on their dramatic promises. Energy policy grounded in fear rather than evidence has produced unreliable power grids, higher costs of living, and industries that depend on perpetual subsidies. None of this is to deny that climate changes or that reasonable environmental policies have value. What the public increasingly objects to is the transformation of uncertain scientific projections into absolute political certainties enforced through mandates, subsidies, and regulations that reshape entire economies. Climate models, however sophisticated, are not crystal balls. Their errors compound over time. Yet the policy consequences of treating these models as infallible fall not on those who make the predictions, but on ordinary citizens who must bear the financial burden. After decades of dire predictions that failed to arrive on schedule, the credibility of climate alarmism has eroded. The public has learned what should have been obvious from the outset, that forecasts of imminent catastrophe often tell us more about political incentives than about atmospheric physics. When each new warning resembles the last, and when none arrive as advertised, people begin, quite rationally, to discount them. In the long run, the public's learned skepticism may be a blessing. A society that treats every prediction as an emergency becomes ungovernable. But a society that evaluates predictions against evidence, costs, and trade-offs is one that can pursue environmental stewardship without succumbing to political hysteria. The real question is not whether the climate changes, but whether we allow the rhetoric of crisis to substitute for reasoned judgment. The public's emerging refusal to do so may be the most hopeful environmental trend of all.